I'm really going to need some feedback on this theme song. Well, this temporary theme song. So, what's going to happen is, I've reached out to an alumnus of Immanuel, who's a very talented musician. I asked him if he'd at all be interested in creating a theme song and some bumper music for this podcast I was looking to start, and he told me he had to think about it. So while my buddy's thinking about it, you'll get to enjoy some, let's see, this is Adrian Walther. This is All For You by Adrian Walther, so... Hi everybody, my name is Aaron Petersen and welcome to episode 1 of the I'm No Expert podcast. And the question we're answering today is, why do we need another podcast? I think an even deeper question for this particular podcast is, why does Immanuel Christian School in El Paso, Texas need to support and power a podcast? Well, in my mind, I guess there's kind of two answers to that question. In a way, we really don't need to power or support a podcast. But a few months ago, sitting down and talking with the former head of school, Mr. Davis, we had talked about possibly getting into doing a podcast. As many of you know, Davis used to love doing his weekly updates and sharing things that are going on at the school with you all. But we wanted to kind of do something that would be a little different than just the standard weekly update that we'd all been accustomed to. So he had mentioned the idea of possibly starting a podcast wherein we would sit down and usually sit down with a guest, whether it was a guest speaker that we're having in chapel that day or that week, or especially during the spiritual renewal week time, have different guest speakers come in and just kind of dive a little deeper into the topics that they were going to be covering that given time. And so we started looking into how we could do that, and it just really wasn't feasible at the time. So as the new school year started, sitting down over lunch with our new head of school, Ms. Frecka, I had mentioned that, we had this idea of possibly starting a podcast. She jumped on the idea right away, and she really loved it. She thought that it was something that could be useful, not only for alumni outreach and for engaging our students here at the school, but also diving deeper into some questions that students have, questions that parents have, having a sense of transparency as a school, and allowing people to really just take that deep dive into the subjects that are being covered and talked about here at ICS. So I started thinking about who I could interview and who I could talk to. And there's plenty of teachers here at ICS who have really interesting backgrounds before they're educators. And one thing about working in a private Christian school is everybody has a testimony, and everybody has a story as to how they got to where they are. As believers, we don't believe that this is an accident. We believe that we've been called to ICS, called to work here, to honor and glorify God in that. As I continued to think about it, I just thought, well, why does this podcast only have to pertain to Immanuel? And the fact of the matter is it doesn't. Because as we start diving into testimonies, and as we start talking to guest speakers, and as different people start coming on the show, whether it be religious topics, societal topics, even sports topics, there's questions out there that apply to anybody who might stumble upon this podcast. So it's going to reach a much wider audience than Immanuel. It's powered by Immanuel, it's backed by Immanuel, it's recorded at Immanuel, but that doesn't mean it's just for Immanuel. Our goal is to get this podcast out on as many mediums as we possibly can. Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I think YouTube even has some sort of podcast function now. And this thing may only get 10 listeners each time we put an episode out, or it may get 1,000. The numbers aren't the point. This podcast is going to have one central theme the entire time, and it's a host who isn't an expert, but just like everybody else, is desperately looking for the answers. So we're going to take the time to sit down with people who might help answer those tough questions, who have taken a few more trips around the sun than I have, and who are just a little bit more well-versed. So I really do hope that whoever finds this podcast can really take something away from it, no matter what we're covering that day. That's the whole point, is just that, you're looking for an answer to something, you're looking for some encouragement, you're looking to see what's going on in the world of sports. You're able to find it here. And I know that sounds really general and broad, but that's the best I have for you right now, honestly. That's because this show is going to be guided directed, produced, with only one goal in mind, and that's to honor and glorify Jesus Christ, and have some fun doing it. I keep saying we want your input, so let me tell you can do that. You can find us right now on X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram at NoExpertPod. We are currently looking into getting a Facebook up and running, but we do have a YouTube channel where you'll be able to listen and hopefully watch at some point. But if you have questions, if you think of an interesting guest you'd like to see on the show here locally in town, your best way to get us your questions and thoughts is going to be through our email address. That's noexpertpod@immanuelwarriors.org. That's noexpertpod@immanuel warriors.org. Feel free to send us your thoughts, your questions, your concerns, and even your criticisms. All of them are welcome. I really wanted to keep this first show short and sweet. Just give you all a rundown of what to expect from the podcast as a whole. Something you'll learn very quickly is that I rarely fully understand what I'm talking about. So I think it would be better to get our first guest out in the very near future and let them run with it. So I try to think of a clever quote or story to kind of round things out. I had even seen an inspirational Instagram story that I thought of sharing, but then I realized I hate it when people do that. Honestly, I would hate any podcast host that would choose to do that, so I'm not going to ruin the sliver of interest you clearly have in this podcast since you've stuck around until the 6-7 minute mark, quoting an Insta story, inspirational quote. I'm just not going to do that. So instead, I'm just going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to leave you with my absolute favorite line from one of my favorite hymns. The name of that hymn is Before the Throne of God Above. It was written in 1863 by an Irish woman named Charity Bancroft. Funny enough, the original title was The Advocate, and I kind of like that. Kind of wish it stuck with that title, but anyways, the line goes, "When Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there, who made an end to all my sin. Because the sinless Savior died, my sinful soul is counted free, for God the just is satisfied to look on him and pardon me." It's Monday. We have a whole week ahead of us. Love as Christ loved, forgive as he forgave. I know none of us will ever be an expert in that, but be a light, just like we'll try to be with this show, and have fun doing it. The I'm No Expert podcast is written, produced, directed, and edited by Aaron Petersen. The theme song for the podcast is All For You by Adrian Walther. Special thanks to Immanuel Christian School for providing us with equipment and support to make this podcast possible.